When the sun rose over the Pacific in the late 1930s, Japan already understood something most of the world had not yet accepted. The next great naval war would not be won by battleships. It would be decided by aircraft carriers. And Japan was preparing for that future with a level of discipline, secrecy, and ambition that stunned even American intelligence officers. In dockyards from Yokosuka to Kure, steel frames began rising into the sky. Workers labored day and night, welding plates in the glow of orange sparks, while engineers refined new ideas about naval aviation. Japan wasn't just building ships, it was shaping a doctrine. The idea was simple but revolutionary. A fast, long-range carrier strike group could cripple an enemy fleet before it even saw its attacker. By 1941, Japan had created something no other nation possessed: a coordinated carrier strike force, the Kido Butai. It combined 6 frontline carriers, each carrying experienced pilots who had trained in complex formation attacks for years. These weren't improvisations. They were rehearsed maneuvers, perfected through long, hard training flights over the warm seas of the inland sea. American observers later wrote that Japanese carrier pilots were the most combat-ready naval airmen in the world. And it wasn't an exaggeration. Japanese aviators flew lighter, more agile aircraft with astonishing range, like the A6M0. Their carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, were fast, coordinated, and lethal. But the real advantage wasn't the hardware. It was timing. In 1941, the U.S. was still debating how many carriers it should build. Japan already knew exactly how many it needed and had trained forces ready to use them. While American shipyards were still expanding, Japanese carriers were already sailing across the Pacific, conducting long-range operations that stunned even their own admirals. When the Kido Butai launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, it wasn't luck. It was the result of a decade of planning. The coordinated launch of hundreds of aircraft in minutes showed the world the full power of Japan's carrier doctrine. For that moment in time, Japan didn't just have more carriers. It had the best carrier strike force on Earth. But behind the impressive victories lay shadows. Japan's industry was limited, its resources finite, and its training pipeline narrow. Still, in these early years, as the Pacific War ignited, Japan held something priceless: momentum. And for a brief but fierce period, it looked as if the empire of the rising sun might dominate the largest ocean on the planet. By the early 1940s, the Pacific War was no longer just a clash of fleets. It was a collision of national philosophies. Japan and the United States both understood the importance of aircraft carriers, but the way they approached building them could not have been more different. Japan pursued perfection. The United States pursued production. In Japanese shipyards, engineers took pride in designing carriers that were fast, sleek, and deadly. The Shokaku-class, for example, was a masterpiece: powerful engines, excellent flight decks, and well-trained crews. But this perfection came at a cost. Building a single carrier often required years of planning, specialized materials, and painstaking craftsmanship. Japan's shipbuilding capacity, limited by scarce steel and fuel, meant every carrier was a high-risk investment. Lose one, and it could not be replaced quickly. American shipyards, by contrast, treated shipbuilding like a wartime assembly line. Carriers were no longer individual engineering marvels. They were products of industry. Massive cranes moved like clockwork, workers welded in shifts around the clock, and steel arrived by the trainload. The U.S. wasn't chasing elegance. It was chasing numbers, reliability, and speed. This difference became crystal clear in 1942. Japan launched new carriers carefully and slowly. America launched them in groups. The Essex-class carrier program symbolized this philosophy. Instead of custom designs, the U.S. created a standardized template that could be replicated across multiple shipyards simultaneously. Every rivet, every beam, every engine had interchangeable parts. The goal was simple: replace losses faster than the enemy could cause them. Meanwhile, Japanese designers were still refining details, adjusting deck layouts, modifying hangars, experimenting with aircraft storage. Their ambition was admirable, even brilliant, but it was the ambition of craftsmen in a war that demanded industrial giants. The contrast grew sharper as the war dragged on. By 1943, American shipyards were launching carriers faster than Japan could repair them. The U.S. built escort carriers, light carriers, and Essex-class fleet carriers in staggering numbers. Japan, struggling with shortages and bombing raids, could barely keep its remaining yards operational. Yet Japanese admirals continued to believe that superior training and superior aircraft could balance the scales. But industry, cold, relentless industry, had become the new battlefield. And on that battlefield, Japan was hopelessly outmatched. By 1944, the Pacific Ocean itself began filling with the shadows of American ships. Carrier after carrier rolled off the slipways, each one bringing hundreds of new pilots, thousands of new sailors, and immense striking power. Japan's beautifully crafted carriers were now isolated masterpieces in a sea of American steel. In the end, the war taught a brutal lesson. In modern conflict, ambition alone is never enough. The nation that can build faster, replace faster, and adapt faster will eventually dominate. The United States didn't win because its carriers were perfect. It won because it could build 17 while Japan struggled to build 6. When the smoke cleared after the early disasters of the Pacific War, Pearl Harbor, the loss of the Lexington, the desperate fighting at Coral Sea, the United States finally understood the scale of the conflict it had been dragged into. The enemy was fast, coordinated, and experienced. And America, for all its industrial muscle, was still waking up. But by mid-1942, the awakening had begun. Inside massive American shipyards stretching from Newport News to Brooklyn to Puget Sound, something extraordinary was happening. Welders worked under showers of sparks, cranes swung steel plates like toys, and entire factories were redirected to supply one goal: build carriers not someday, but now. And the centerpiece of this awakening was a new kind of warship, the Essex-class aircraft carrier. The Essex wasn't designed to be perfect. It was designed to be unstoppable. Bigger flight decks, stronger armor, better elevators, and more aircraft, all built into a standardized design that could be copied across the country. For the first time, American shipbuilding had found a way to turn aircraft carriers into something like a mass-produced weapon. As hull numbers multiplied, the spirit of American industry transformed. Workers joked that they could build Essexes in their sleep. Entire communities adopted carriers like hometown football teams, celebrating each milestone as if the shipyard itself were fighting the war. Then, in the spring of 1943, the first completed Essex-class ships steamed toward the Pacific. The Japanese Navy, still recovering from losses at Midway, watched a new reality unfold. These weren't single replacements for lost ships. They were the beginning of a tidal wave. Every few months, another Essex appeared. Then another. By 1944, the Pacific Ocean seemed to tilt under the weight of American decks stretching toward the horizon. Task Force 58, the world's most powerful naval striking force, effectively became a floating empire of steel, aviation fuel, and relentless momentum. And everywhere those carriers went, the war changed. With their enormous air groups, the Essexes could project overwhelming force day after day, launching hundreds of fighters and bombers in coordinated waves. Unlike Japan, whose pilots and aircraft were irreplaceable, the U.S. could rotate pilots, repair damage quickly, and return to the fight with fresh strength. During operations in the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, and the battles leading to the Philippines, the Essex-class carriers became the engine of the American advance. Japan was no longer facing a navy, it was facing an industrial storm. Yet the most remarkable part wasn't the ships themselves, but the system behind them. Spare parts arrived by train, aircraft factories doubled production, shipyards expanded to 3 shifts. America was no longer reacting to the war, it was driving it. By late 1944, when massive carrier battles like the Philippine Sea unfolded, Japan's pilots faced a grim truth. Every time they shot down an American plane, another took its place within hours. Every time an Essex was damaged, it was repaired in days. Every time Japan built a new carrier, America launched 3 more. The Essex-class didn't just represent a technological leap. It represented the moment America fully awakened, not as a wounded nation, but as an industrial titan that would not be stopped. By mid-1943, the Pacific was no longer the playground of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Not because their pilots suddenly forgot how to fly, and not because their carriers magically evaporated, although, to be fair, several of them did vanish beneath the waves with impressive speed. The real reason was simpler. The United States had finally stopped hitting the snooze button and arrived with more carriers than Japan could ever hope to sink. It started with the aftermath of Midway. Japan lost 4 frontline carriers in a single, catastrophic day: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, ships that had once terrorized half the ocean. Replacing them wasn't just hard, it was basically impossible. Japan's shipyards were small, limited, and overworked. Meanwhile, America's shipyards were producing Essex-class carriers like an assembly line stamping out toasters. By early 1944, U.S. carrier task forces were moving across the Pacific like floating cities of steel. The Japanese called them the Great Blue Fleet, partly out of fear and partly because, well, what else do you call a battle group that brings hundreds of aircraft, radar, anti-air guns, and enough firepower to rewrite the map? The turning point came with the Mariana and Palau campaign. The U.S. launched Operation Forager, an offensive designed to seize the islands Japan relied on to protect its empire. Japanese commanders hoped for a decisive battle that would restore their fortunes. Instead, they got the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a battle so one-sided that American pilots joked they felt like they were on a hunting trip rather than a dogfight. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were shot down. Many of the pilots had barely finished accelerated emergency training. They flew outdated tactics against veteran American flyers guided by radar, coordinated by well-drilled combat information centers, and supported by the enormous flight decks of the Essex-class carriers. Japan lost air groups they could never replace. America lost, well, a few planes that usually made it back to the carriers anyway. But the real knockout punch wasn't just fighters and fleet engagements, it was logistics. U.S. fast carrier task forces were refueled at sea, resupplied constantly, and kept in near-continuous action. Japan, on the other hand, struggled to move fuel to its ships at all. A carrier without aviation fuel is basically a very expensive raft. By the time the Battle of Leyte Gulf erupted, the outcome was almost inevitable. American carriers launched wave after wave of strikes that crippled the remnants of Japan's fleet. The once dominant Kido Butai, the pride of the Imperial Navy, was reduced to shadows and smoke. Carrier dominance shifted not because of luck, but because one nation could build, maintain, and operate carriers at a scale the other simply couldn't match. The Pacific Ocean, once contested, slowly turned into an American-controlled highway stretching straight toward Japan's doorstep. Japan had started the war with daring, skill, and the finest carrier force in the world. But by 1944, the tide had turned completely. The future of naval warfare belonged to industrial power, logistics, and air superiority, and in all three the United States now towered like a giant. By 1944, the war in the Pacific no longer looked like a duel between two naval powers. It looked like an arm-wrestling match where one side, Japan, had muscles built from hope, tradition, and overconfidence, while the other side, the United States, had an entire steel factory strapped to its arm. Japan entered the war believing quality would beat quantity. Their early carriers, their Zero fighters, their highly trained pilots, all of it was world-class. But the empire had one fatal weakness. It couldn't replace anything it lost. Every carrier sunk, every veteran pilot killed, every factory bombed meant a whole Japan simply didn't have the industrial capacity to refill. The United States, meanwhile, made replacement not a challenge but a routine. A ship damaged? Repair it in days. A plane lost? Build 2 more. America's wartime economy was a machine. 24 hours a day, thousands of ships, tens of thousands of aircraft, and millions of tons of supplies poured out of factories that never slept. By mid-war, the contrast became almost absurd. Japan built 6 fleet carriers in 3 years. The US built 17 in the same time, and then stopped counting because the numbers got ridiculous. While Japan struggled to produce a few dozen aircraft a month, US factories were producing aircraft by the hundreds. Entire air groups could be replaced in a single shipment. Fuel, the invisible war winner, told an even harsher story. Japan lacked domestic oil and relied on long, vulnerable supply lines. Once American submarines started tearing through Japanese tankers, the empire's greatest ships were trapped in port, starving for fuel. Some carriers could barely afford to train pilots. Others couldn't even leave harbor. A navy without fuel is just a collection of floating museums. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy operated like an industrial symphony. Gigantic logistics fleets refueled carriers at sea, allowing operations to continue non-stop for months. Supply ships shadowed the task forces. New Essex-class carriers joined the fleet so fast that admirals joked they needed a calendar just to remember their names. Even damaged ships were returned to battle at a pace Japan could only dream of. Japan tried to adapt. They built smaller carriers, emergency fighters, and rushed inexperienced pilots into combat. But the math refused to cooperate. Veteran instructors were dead. Factories were bombed. Resources dwindled. Every Japanese loss, a carrier, a cruiser, even a single experienced pilot, was permanent. Every American loss was temporary. By late 1944, the industrial knockout was complete. The Battle of Leyte Gulf showcased the final humiliation. Japan deployed a decoy carrier force with almost no planes, hoping to draw U.S. carriers away. The world's former premier carrier navy had been reduced to using empty flight decks as bait. Numbers didn't just decide the war, they crushed an empire. Japan fought with skill, courage, and innovation, but industrial power wrote the ending. Factories, fuel, manpower, logistics, these were the true superweapons of the Pacific. And once the United States unleashed them, the outcome was no longer in question.